2 days after I bought the 2026 BMW X5 I'd worked years to afford, my parents demanded I hand the keys to my sister as her anniversary gift, in front of nearly 200 guests. When I said no, my father exploded, grabbed the heavy cake stand, and before I could step away, it connected with my head. My mother defended him. My sister stood there expecting me to stay quiet like I always had. Instead, I turned toward those 200 guests and finally exposed the secret I'd been hiding about my father for years. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I work as a senior project manager for a commercial construction company. Most people who meet me now see someone organized, independent, and probably a little too serious about schedules. They don't see how long it took me to become that woman. I started as a junior project coordinator, straight out of college, taking whatever assignments nobody else wanted. I stayed late when deadlines slipped, spent Saturdays walking unfinished job sites, and learned how to handle contractors twice my age who assumed I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't handed my career. I built it one promotion at a time. That mattered to me because growing up, I learned early that if I wanted something for myself, I needed to earn it myself. My parents, Thomas and Linda Brooks, loved telling people they had raised 2 successful daughters, but inside our home, my older sister Brittany and I had never been treated the same. Brittany was the daughter everyone protected. I was the daughter everyone depended on. If Brittany made a mistake, there was always an explanation. If I made one, there was a lecture. If Brittany needed help, we were a family and everyone had to contribute. If I needed something, I was reminded that I was capable of handling it myself. For years, I convinced myself that being the dependable daughter was something to be proud of. I thought keeping the peace made me mature. I thought swallowing my frustration made me strong. What I didn't understand was that every time I quietly gave in, my family learned to expect a little more from me. And by the time I finally understood how far that expectation had gone, saying one simple word, no, was enough to turn my sister's anniversary into the night our entire family came apart. Brittany was 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, my parents found a reason to put her first. It wasn't obvious enough that strangers would notice. There were no dramatic speeches about loving her more. It happened in smaller ways, which somehow made it easier for me to excuse. When Brittany turned 16, Dad helped her buy her first car because she needed something reliable. When I turned 16, he told me getting a part-time job would teach me responsibility. I spent an entire summer working at a grocery store and bought a used Honda with money I had saved. Mom actually smiled when she saw it and said, "See, you didn't need us after all." At the time, I took that as a compliment. That pattern followed us into adulthood. Brittany married Brandon Hayes and settled into a comfortable life, but whenever she wanted something beyond what they could afford, Mom and Dad somehow made it a family issue. One year, Brittany wanted new furniture. Dad called and asked whether I could help her out with $3,000. Another time, Mom suggested I cover part of Brittany and Brandon's vacation because their anniversary had been stressful to plan. I refused that one, and Mom barely spoke to me for a week. Somehow, Brittany's wants were treated like emergencies, while my boundaries were treated like selfishness. Brandon never seemed comfortable with it. He was polite to my parents, but I noticed the way his expression changed whenever Dad offered Brittany something she hadn't earned. Once, after dinner, he quietly told me, "You know you don't have to keep fixing things for everybody." I laughed it off because admitting he was right would have forced me to admit how unhealthy everything had become. The strangest part was that Brittany never really asked me directly. She didn't have to. Mom would make the request, Dad would apply the pressure, and Brittany would sit there quietly until I gave in. Then she would hug me and say, "You're the best sister." I spent years mistaking that routine for love. By the time Brittany started planning her anniversary celebration, I had finally become better at saying no. She and Brandon were expecting close to 200 guests, and my parents were treating the night like a second wedding. I promised myself I would attend, bring a normal gift, congratulate my sister, and go home without getting pulled into another family obligation. I genuinely believed I could manage that. What I didn't know was that my parents had already decided I was bringing something much more expensive than a gift. By then, I had spent almost 9 years building a career that belonged entirely to me. I started at 22 as a junior project coordinator, earning enough to cover rent, groceries, my student loan payment, and not much else. My first apartment outside uptown Charlotte was small enough that I could stand in the kitchen and see almost everything I owned. I didn't care. For the first time, nobody could tell me what I owed Brittany or what I should sacrifice to keep everyone happy. Commercial construction wasn't an easy field to grow in. I learned quickly that being prepared mattered more than being liked. I showed up early, knew my numbers, remembered every deadline, and stopped apologizing when I had to tell someone twice my age that their work was behind schedule. Over the years, I moved from coordinating small renovation projects to managing multi-million-dollar commercial jobs. By 31, I was a senior project manager. The promotions came with better money, but I never suddenly started living like I was rich. I paid off my student loans. I built an emergency fund. I increased my retirement contributions, and every month, after everything important was covered, I transferred money into one savings account I had privately named X5. I had wanted a BMW X5 for years. It wasn't about impressing anyone. I spent enough time driving between job sites that I wanted something I genuinely loved getting into every morning. Whenever I saw an X5 on the road, I would tell myself, "Not yet, keep working." Dad knew I wanted one. He used to tease me about it. "You're going to spend that much on a car?" he once asked. "When I can afford it responsibly, yes." He laughed. "You always did like proving a point." Maybe I did, but the point was never for him. Eventually, I reached the number I had set for myself. I could make a substantial down payment, keep my emergency savings untouched, and comfortably handle the remaining payments without changing the rest of my life. I didn't tell my parents I was shopping. I didn't tell Brittany either. I had finally learned that sharing good news with my family sometimes turned an accomplishment into a discussion about what I could do for somebody else. So when everything was ready, I scheduled an appointment at the dealership. It happened to fall 2 days before Brittany's anniversary. At the time, I thought the timing was completely irrelevant. By the end of that week, I would understand just how wrong I was. 2 days before Brittany's anniversary, I left work a little early and drove to the BMW dealership in Charlotte. I had already done the research, checked the numbers twice, and decided exactly what I was comfortable spending. I wasn't walking in hoping someone would convince me to buy my dream car. I was walking in knowing I had finally earned it. When the salesman handed me the keys to my 2026 BMW X5, I just stood there for a second, looking at them in my palm. 9 years of early mornings, difficult projects, delayed vacations, and disciplined saving had turned into something real. I sat behind the wheel before leaving and ran my hands over it with the biggest smile on my face. Then I took one picture and sent it to our family group chat. "Finally did it. Bought my X5, Brittany replied first. "Wait, you actually bought it?" Mom followed with 3 shocked emojis. Dad called me less than a minute later. "You bought a brand new BMW?" I did. "How much did you put down?" I laughed because it was such a dad question. "Enough." He went quiet for a moment, then he said, "Well, bring it Saturday. Brittany will want to see it." Something about the way he said that stayed with me, but I didn't give it much thought. The next evening, Brittany called. She asked about the interior, the features, and how it drove. Then she joked, "Maybe you should just give it to me for my anniversary." I laughed. "Nice try." She laughed too, but hers faded first. "Mom said you could easily get another one." That stopped me. Why would Mom say that? "Oh, Natalie, relax. I'm kidding." She changed the subject, and I let her. Saturday afternoon, I bought Brittany and Brandon the gift I had already planned for them and placed it in the back of my X5. Before getting out of the car at the anniversary venue, I sat there for a moment, looking through the windshield. I remember thinking how good my life felt. I had a career I was proud of. I had bought something I had wanted for years. And for once, I wasn't arriving at a family event carrying some problem I had been asked to solve. I grabbed the gift and locked the BMW behind me. I had no idea my family had already decided those keys belonged to Brittany. The anniversary party was being held at an event venue outside Charlotte, the kind of place with tall windows, polished floors, and enough room for nearly 200 people without feeling crowded. Brittany had always loved big celebrations, and my parents had clearly helped her turn this one into something much larger than I expected. There were flowers everywhere, a long dessert table near the back, and a tall anniversary cake displayed on a heavy decorative stand. By the time I walked in, most of the tables were already full. Brittany spotted me almost immediately. She came over, hugged me, thanked me for coming, and then looked past my shoulder toward the parking lot. "Where is it?" I knew exactly what she meant. "Hello to you too." She laughed. "Come on, I want to see the BMW. I'll show you later." Mom appeared before Brittany could answer. She hugged me quickly and asked the same question. "You brought the X5, right?" "Yes." Her face brightened in a way that made me uncomfortable. Dad joined us a few minutes later. Instead of asking about work, or even saying hello properly, he asked where I had parked. I pointed toward the side lot. He nodded. "Good." That was all he said. I should have realized then that something was wrong. I found Brandon near the front of the room talking to some friends. He looked exhausted but happy. When I handed him the gift I had brought for him and Brittany, he thanked me and said, "You really didn't need to get us anything." Before I could answer, Brittany walked up behind me. She definitely did. Brandon looked at her, then at me. I smiled, but I noticed the awkward pause. Later, I saw Stephen Walsh standing near one of the tables. Stephen had known Dad for years. He had once handled legal work connected to Dad's business, and he had known our family since Brittany and I were teenagers. Dad and Stephen weren't as close as they used to be, but Stephen still appeared at major family events. He greeted me warmly. "How's construction treating you?" "Still keeping me busy. I heard you made senior project manager." I smiled. "Last year." "That's a big deal, Natalie. Congratulations." It was such a simple thing to say, but I remember it because nobody in my immediate family had said anything like that all evening. Dinner ended, speeches began, and people started gathering closer to Brittany and Brandon for the cake cutting. I was standing near the edge of the crowd when Mom came over and touched my arm. "Your father wants to talk to you." "About what?" She glanced toward Dad. "The car." My stomach tightened. I followed her because I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation. Dad was waiting beside Brittany. When I reached them, he didn't lower his voice or pull me somewhere private. He simply held out his hand and said, "Give me the BMW keys." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. Then Brittany smiled, and I realized her joke on the phone had never been a joke. I looked at Dad's open hand, then at Brittany. "Why would I give you my keys?" Dad frowned like I was deliberately making something simple difficult. "Because we're giving the BMW to Brittany." For a second, I couldn't even answer. "What do you mean, we?" Mom stepped closer. "Natalie, don't make this awkward. Your sister's anniversary is important." I stared at her. "I brought them a gift. Brandon already has it." Brittany folded her arms. "Mom and Dad thought the car would mean more." "The car I bought 2 days ago? You can afford another one," she said. There was no embarrassment in her voice. That was the part that stunned me. She actually expected me to consider it. I turned back to Dad. "Did you seriously bring me over here to tell me to give away a car I worked years to buy?" His jaw tightened. "I'm asking you to do something generous for your sister." "No. You're asking me to hand Brittany my BMW." A few people nearby had started looking toward us. I lowered my voice. The answer is no, Mom immediately whispered. Natalie, I looked at her. No. Dad took another step toward me. Think carefully before you embarrass this family. That sentence brought back every birthday, every loan, every favor, every time Brittany's happiness had somehow become my responsibility. I felt something inside me settle. I'm not embarrassing anyone. I bought the car. It belongs to me. I'm keeping it. Brittany shook her head. You're unbelievable. You don't even have kids. What do you need a car like that for? Because I wanted it. That's your reason? It's the only reason I need. Brandon had noticed the argument by then and walked over. What's going on? Brittany answered before I could. Natalie won't give me the BMW. Brandon stared at her. Give you her car? For our anniversary. His expression changed. Brittany, I never asked for that. Dad cut in. This is between family. Brandon looked at him. I'm her husband. Apparently it's my anniversary gift too, so I think I get to say I don't want Natalie's car. I thought that would end it. Instead, Dad looked at me as if Brandon's objection were somehow my fault. Look what you've started. I didn't start anything. His voice rose. After everything we've done for you, you have the nerve to stand here and tell us no? Conversations around us began dying down. More faces turned our way. Mom grabbed Dad's arm, but not to stop him. She looked at me and said, just give Brittany the keys and we can enjoy the evening. I reached into my purse. Brittany's eyes immediately dropped toward it. I pulled out my keys, held them tightly in my hand, and looked at all three of them. These are mine. I paid for that BMW. I earned it. And nobody in this family is taking it from me. Dad's face changed. You have the nerve to say no to me? Yes, I said. I do. By then, nearly the entire room had gone quiet, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care who heard me. Dad stared at me for a few seconds, almost as if he was waiting for me to take the word back. I didn't. Put the keys in my hand, Natalie. No. His voice rose. I am your father. And it's still my car. That was when he lost control. Everything happened quickly. Dad reached toward the cake table, grabbed the heavy stand, and swung it at me. Before I could move away, it connected with my head. The room went completely silent. I stepped back, trying to understand what had just happened. Brandon immediately moved between us. Thomas, what are you doing? Mom rushed forward, but the first words out of her mouth weren't directed at Dad. They were directed at me. Natalie, why did you have to push him this far? I stared at her. Even then, she was defending him. Brittany came to her side. You knew Dad was getting angry. You should have just stopped arguing. I looked from my mother to my sister, and something inside me finally changed. For years, I had protected this family from consequences. I had stayed quiet when Dad crossed lines. I had covered for Mom when she defended him. And most of all, I had protected one secret, because I believed exposing it would destroy our family. Standing there in front of nearly 200 people, I realized there was nothing left for me to protect. Dad pointed toward the exit. Get out. I looked past him and saw Stephen Walsh watching us from across the room. His expression told me he already knew exactly what I was thinking about. Dad followed my eyes toward Stephen, and for the first time that night, the anger disappeared from his face. I turned toward the guests. Before I leave, I said, there's something everyone here deserves to know about my father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear me. 3 years ago, my father told this family that his business nearly collapsed because one of his partners made a bad investment. That wasn't true. Dad stepped toward me. Natalie, stop. I looked directly at him. You told Mom you lost $420,000 because someone else mishandled company money. You told Brittany the same thing. Then you asked me for $38,000 because you said you were trying to keep employees from losing their jobs. Brittany turned toward Dad. What is she talking about? I kept going. The money wasn't lost in a bad investment. Dad moved company funds into an account he controlled and used part of it to cover personal debts he had hidden from everyone. Dad's face tightened. That is a lie. No, Thomas, Stephen said from behind the crowd. Everyone turned. Stephen walked toward us slowly. Dad immediately pointed at him. Stay out of this. Stephen stopped a few feet away. You know I can't confirm something that isn't true, Thomas. Unfortunately for you, this is true. I felt Brittany staring at me. Mom looked terrified. That told me something else. She already knew more than she had ever admitted. I reached into my purse and took out my phone. I found out because Dad accidentally sent me a folder that was supposed to go to his accountant. It contained transfer records, account statements, and emails. I called Stephen because his name appeared on older company documents. Stephen nodded. I advised Natalie to preserve everything exactly as she received it. Dad looked around at the guests. This is a family disagreement. Nobody here understands the business. Then explain the signatures, I said. He stopped talking. Explain why one transfer carried the name of a former business associate who told Stephen he never authorized it. Mom grabbed my arm. Enough, Natalie. Please. I pulled my arm free. You knew, didn't you? She didn't answer. I remembered the $38,000 I had given Dad. I remembered him sitting across from me, telling me people's jobs depended on him. I had protected the truth afterward because Mom begged me not to destroy the family, and Dad promised Stephen he would correct everything privately. I looked at Mom. You convinced me to stay quiet for 3 years. Then I looked at Dad. And tonight you reminded me exactly what my silence bought you. Stephen stepped closer. Thomas, after what happened here tonight, I'm done protecting private arrangements too. The records need to be handled properly now. For the first time since Dad demanded my BMW keys, he had nothing to say. Dad finally found his voice. Everyone needs to leave. This party is over. Nobody moved at first. People were staring at him, at Stephen, at Mom, and then at Brittany. The perfect anniversary my parents had spent months arranging had become the one room Dad couldn't control. Brittany turned on me. You did this on purpose. I almost laughed. I came here with an anniversary gift. Dad asked for my car. You could have handled this privately. Brandon looked at her. Privately? Your father just demanded her BMW, and you stood there supporting him. Stay out of it, Brandon. I tried. Then you told your sister she should give you a car she bought herself. Brittany's face hardened. Whose side are you on? Brandon stared at her for a long moment. That question is exactly the problem. Mom started crying and asked me to tell Stephen that Dad had intended to repay everything. I told her I wouldn't lie for either of them again. Stephen made it clear that the records would now go where they legally needed to go, and that any questionable signatures or transfers would have to be examined properly. Dad tried calling me repeatedly after I left. I didn't answer. Within days, Stephen contacted the appropriate people connected to the old business records, and the private story Dad had maintained for 3 years began unraveling. Former associates started asking questions. Financial records were reviewed. Dad could no longer explain everything away as one bad investment. Mom called me and said I was destroying their retirement. I reminded her that I hadn't moved the money or signed anyone else's name. I had simply stopped hiding what happened. Brittany blamed me too, but her own marriage was beginning to crack. Brandon moved out less than 2 weeks after the anniversary. He later told me the BMW argument wasn't the only reason. Watching Brittany defend Dad, then blame me afterward, had forced him to admit how often she treated other people's money and boundaries as if they didn't matter. For years, my family had survived because somebody always absorbed the consequences. Usually, that somebody was me. This time, I stepped aside and let those consequences land exactly where they belonged. Over the next several months, Dad's situation became something he couldn't talk his way out of. The financial records Stephen had preserved led to formal legal action, and Dad was ultimately held responsible for the unauthorized transfers and false documentation connected to the business. He had to repay money, cover substantial legal costs, and sell assets he had spent years showing off. His reputation among former partners disappeared with them. Mom stayed beside him, but that choice cost her too. The comfortable retirement she had protected by pressuring me into silence was gone, and several relatives stopped speaking to her after learning she had known enough to help keep the truth buried. Brittany kept insisting I had ruined everyone's lives. Brandon didn't agree. He never moved back home. Months later, he filed for divorce. Brittany called me the day she received the papers and demanded that I convince him to reconsider. I refused. For once, I didn't explain myself. I didn't apologize. I didn't offer money or try to repair a problem I hadn't created. Dad lost the security his deception had built. Mom lost the family image she had protected at my expense. Brittany lost a marriage she assumed would survive anything. And I finally stopped paying for choices that were never mine. Months later, I was driving my BMW home from work when I realized I no longer felt guilty about any of it. My family had spent years teaching me that love meant giving until I had nothing left to protect for myself. They were wrong. I still had my career, my home, my independence, and the life I had built with my own hands. The X5 was still mine too, but by then, it meant something different. It wasn't just the car I had worked years to buy. It reminded me of the first time I said no, and finally meant it.